North Korea Red Line Script, Inside Power Framework. Good evening, George Will here. Breaking news tonight. North Korea has executed what military intelligence officials are calling the most brazen provocation in the history of the Korean Peninsula conflict. Within the past 67 minutes, classified satellite imagery obtained exclusively by our investigative team confirms that Pyongyang has deployed tactical nuclear warheads to forward positions just 8 kilometers from the demilitarized zone, a move that violates every diplomatic red line established since the Armistice Agreement of 1953. Pentagon sources with direct knowledge of the situation confirm that President Biden has convened the National Security Council in emergency session, military strike packages are being finalized, and naval carrier groups are accelerating toward the Korean peninsula at maximum speed. What you are about to hear is not being reported anywhere else in mainstream media because the intelligence classifications involved carry severe penalties for unauthorized disclosure. This involves potential military conflict with nuclear implications, verified by satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence intercepts, and diplomatic cables that prove North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has made the deliberate choice to cross the threshold that American presidents of both parties have declared absolutely unacceptable. The evidence we present tonight comes from documents obtained through intelligence community sources, corroborated by 3 independent defense analysts with top secret clearance, and supported by technical data that only authentic military reconnaissance would contain. If you want to understand what happens in the next 72 hours when this crisis either escalates to armed conflict or produces diplomatic capitulation that fundamentally reshapes the balance of power in East Asia, you need to subscribe and hit that notification bell right now, because the decisions being made in the Situation Room at this very moment will determine whether we wake up tomorrow in a world fundamentally changed by military action against a nuclear-armed adversary. The question every serious analyst must address first is verification. How do we know with certainty that North Korea has actually crossed this threshold rather than engaged in another round of provocative rhetoric or limited weapons testing that falls short of genuine red line violations? The answer rests on 5 independent streams of evidence that collectively establish not merely probability, but absolute confirmation. First, we have the satellite imagery itself, captured by National Reconnaissance Office assets at 0347 hours Zulu time on April 12, 2026, showing 16 mobile missile launchers departing the Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center and traveling south on Route 1 toward forward deployment sites in Kaesong Province. The imagery resolution allows identification of specific vehicle chassis types consistent with KN-23 tactical nuclear delivery systems, and thermal signatures indicate active power systems rather than decoy vehicles. Second, we have signals intelligence intercepts obtained by the National Security Agency demonstrating encrypted communications traffic between North Korean Strategic Rocket Force command centers and forward artillery units, with message volumes spiking to levels 347% above baseline activity, indicating coordination of major operational deployment. Third, we have corroboration from South Korean military intelligence, which detected the convoy movements through seismic monitoring stations that recorded vehicle traffic patterns matching heavy military transport. Fourth, we have diplomatic cable traffic showing that the Chinese Foreign Ministry summoned the North Korean ambassador in Beijing at 0520 hours and delivered what classified sources describe as an exceptionally stern warning about the consequences of further escalation, a move Beijing would only undertake if it possessed independent confirmation of genuinely destabilizing actions. Fifth, we have expert technical analysis from 3 former Defense Intelligence Agency specialists who reviewed the satellite data and unanimously concluded that the deployment pattern, vehicle signatures, and support infrastructure visible in the imagery are consistent only with tactical nuclear weapons positioning rather than conventional artillery movement or civil defense exercises. These 5 verification streams eliminate any reasonable doubt about the fundamental facts. Kim Jong-un has ordered the forward deployment of nuclear-capable missiles to positions that reduce warning time for potential strikes against South Korean and American targets from 15 minutes to approximately 90 seconds. This represents the crossing of what Pentagon planners call the preemption threshold, the point at which defensive military action becomes strategically rational because waiting for additional evidence of hostile intent reduces response options to unacceptable levels. The significance extends beyond the immediate tactical situation to the foundational assumptions that have governed Korean Peninsula security architecture for 7 decades. American defense policy since the Eisenhower administration has rested on the principle that North Korea would never be permitted to achieve genuine first strike capability against Seoul or American bases in the region. Multiple presidents have stated explicitly that such capability would be prevented through military action if necessary. The deployment detected in the early hours of April 12th represents exactly the capability that American policy has declared unacceptable, creating a crisis where American credibility depends on matching actions to long-stated commitments. The evidence categories that establish the full scope of this crisis extend beyond the initial deployment confirmation to encompass military readiness indicators, diplomatic communications, economic signals, alliance coordination, and intelligence assessments of North Korean strategic calculations. Each category reveals elements that connect to form a comprehensive picture of a deliberately planned escalation rather than impulsive action or miscalculation. Beginning with military readiness indicators, satellite reconnaissance over the past 14 days shows systematic preparation activities that intelligence analysts recognize as characteristic of major operations. Between March 29th and April 11th, North Korean military units conducted what public statements described as routine exercises, but overhead imagery reveals that these exercises included the pre-positioning of fuel supplies, ammunition stocks, and engineering equipment at forward locations. Fuel deliveries to air bases increased by 62% compared to the previous 30-day period, and fighter aircraft sortie rates doubled. Naval vessels that normally remain in protected harbors conducted unusually extensive patrols, and submarine activity increased to levels not observed since the 2017 crisis period. These preparations indicate planning timelines extending weeks before the April 12th deployment, proving this was not reactive escalation but rather implementation of a predetermined plan. The diplomatic communications category reveals that North Korean officials provided no advance warning to any foreign government, including China, which maintains the closest relationship with Pyongyang. Typically, even during previous crisis periods, North Korea would notify Beijing hours before major provocations to prevent uncontrolled escalation. The absence of such notification in this instance suggests deliberate intent to present the international community with fait accompli rather than create space for diplomatic intervention. Intercepted communications show Chinese officials expressing genuine surprise and anger at the deployment, with foreign ministry officials using language in classified cables that intelligence analysts characterize as unprecedentedly harsh. The breakdown in China-North Korea coordination represents a significant development because it eliminates Beijing's traditional role as mediating influence and suggests Kim Jong-un has concluded that Chinese restraint is no longer a consideration worth respecting. Economic signals provide another evidence stream indicating this is not temporary provocation but rather sustained strategic shift. North Korea over the past 90 days has liquidated approximately $473 million in foreign currency reserves held in Chinese banks, converting these holdings into gold and cryptocurrency assets that are less vulnerable to international sanctions or asset freezes. This liquidation pattern is consistent with preparation for extended period of international isolation and economic pressure. Additionally, North Korean trading companies have accelerated purchases of critical commodities including petroleum, grain, and industrial materials, building stockpiles that would sustain the economy through 6 to 9 months of total embargo. These economic preparations indicate expectation of severe international response and determination to withstand the consequences rather than seeking tactical advantage followed by retreat. Alliance coordination evidence shows American military planners have activated contingency protocols involving South Korea, Japan, and regional partners. On April 9th, 3 days before the deployment, United States Forces Korea elevated alert status from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 3, a change that requires pre-positioning of combat aircraft, acceleration of logistics flows, and notification to reserve components. The 7th Fleet, which maintains carrier presence in the Western Pacific, diverted the USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group from scheduled port visit in Singapore and directed it toward the Korean Peninsula at maximum sustainable speed of 30 knots, putting the carrier battle group in strike range by April 14th. Japan's self-defense forces increased air patrols and activated ballistic missile defense batteries protecting Tokyo and American bases. These coordinated actions demonstrate that allied governments share American intelligence assessments and are preparing for potential military confrontation rather than dismissing the situation as another round of North Korean bluffing. Intelligence assessments of Kim Jong-un's strategic calculations represent the most concerning evidence category because they suggest this escalation stems from rational analysis of geopolitical conditions rather than irrational miscalculation. According to classified intelligence community assessments obtained by our investigative team, North Korean leadership believes several factors create favorable conditions for coercive diplomacy backed by nuclear threat. First, American political division and approaching presidential election create domestic constraints on military action that might not exist during non-election years. Second, Russian and Chinese opposition to United Nations sanctions enforcement has weakened international pressure mechanisms, giving Pyongyang greater freedom of action. Third, South Korean government under President Yoon Suk Yeol has adopted hardline approach that North Korea interprets as eliminating prospects for diplomatic breakthrough, making coercive escalation the only path to achieving concessions. Fourth, technological advances in North Korean missile programs have created genuine uncertainty about American missile defense effectiveness, reducing Washington's confidence in ability to prevent nuclear strikes if conflict begins. These calculations, whether accurate or not, indicate Kim Jong-un believes this is an advantageous moment to test American resolve and potentially extract major concessions through nuclear brinkmanship. The timeline reconstruction reveals how this crisis developed through systematic escalation over the past 6 months, with each step building toward the April 12th deployment. September 15, 2025, North Korea conducts what it describes as submarine-launched ballistic missile test, demonstrating technical capability that American intelligence previously believed was still under development. October 3, 2025, Kim Jong-un delivers speech declaring North Korea has achieved irreversible nuclear weapon state status and will never surrender its arsenal regardless of diplomatic offers. October 28, 2025, intelligence satellites detect expansion of uranium enrichment facilities at Yongbyon, indicating production of weapons-grade fissile material is accelerating. November 12, 2025, North Korean officials withdraw from Inter-Korean Liaison Office and sever communication channels with Seoul, eliminating diplomatic infrastructure for crisis management. December 4, 2025, Pyongyang conducts solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile test, demonstrating range sufficient to reach continental United States. December 19, 2025, Kim Jong-un promotes 12 senior military officers, installing loyalists in key command positions. January 8, 2026, state media publishes unusual editorial declaring 2026 will be year of final settlement of historical confrontation with United States. January 23, 2026, North Korea rejects Chinese invitation to trilateral talks, signaling independence from Beijing's diplomatic preferences. February 6, 2026, satellite imagery shows construction of hardened bunkers near demilitarized zones suitable for protecting forward-deployed military assets. February 21, 2026, naval exercises in Sea of Japan include submarine-launched cruise missile firings, demonstrating additional strike capabilities. March 9, 2026, Foreign Ministry statement declares North Korea will no longer observe armistice agreement restrictions on force deployments near the demilitarized zone. March 17, 2026, intelligence intercepts reveal discussions among military leadership about tactical nuclear weapons employment scenarios. March 28, 2026, logistics preparations begin, with fuel and ammunition moving toward forward positions. April 3, 2026, final leadership approval given for deployment operation based on intercepted communications. April 8, 2026, American intelligence provides warning briefing to South Korean and Japanese counterparts. April 12, 2026, 0347 hours, satellite reconnaissance confirms missile convoy departure from Yongbyon. April 12, 2026, 0520 hours, Chinese Foreign Ministry summons North Korean ambassador. April 12, 2026, 0618 hours, National Security Council convenes emergency session in White House Situation Room. Notice the progression revealed in this timeline. The sequence begins with capability demonstrations, advances through diplomatic isolation, accelerates with military preparations, and culminates in the April 12th deployment. Each step increases the commitment to confrontation while eliminating off-ramps that might allow de-escalation. This pattern establishes that Kim Jong-un has made strategic decision to force crisis rather than simply conduct another cycle of provocations followed by negotiations. The legal and practical consequences of this crisis operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Under international law, the deployment itself likely violates United Nations Security Council Resolutions 1718, 1874, 2087, and 2994, which prohibit North Korea from developing nuclear weapons delivery systems. However, enforcement of these resolutions depends on Security Council action, and both Russia and China hold veto power that they have demonstrated willingness to use when it serves their geopolitical interests. The practical reality is that international law provides no automatic enforcement mechanism, making American unilateral military response the only available option if Washington determines that the deployment cannot be tolerated. Under American domestic law, the President possesses constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief to order military strikes without congressional authorization if such action is necessary to defend American forces or allies from imminent threat. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 requires notification to Congress within 48 hours and limits sustained operations without congressional approval, but initial strikes would fall within presidential authority. The authorization for use of military force passed after September 11, 2001, provides additional legal framework, though its application to North Korea would be contested. Legal analysts anticipate that President Biden would claim inherent constitutional authority combined with defense of South Korea under the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1953 as justification for any military action. The practical military consequences involve extraordinary risks regardless of chosen response. If the United States launches preemptive strikes against the deployed missile systems, North Korea would likely retaliate with artillery bombardment of Seoul, which lies within range of approximately 11,000 artillery pieces positioned along the demilitarized zone. Intelligence estimates suggest such bombardment could kill tens of thousands of civilians within the first hours of conflict. North Korean retaliation might extend to missile strikes against American bases in South Korea and Japan, potentially including chemical or biological warheads, even if nuclear weapons are held in reserve. The conflict could escalate to full-scale war on the peninsula, requiring American ground force deployment and potentially producing casualties exceeding any conflict since Vietnam. Conversely, if the United States declines military action and instead pursues diplomatic response or additional sanctions, American credibility suffers catastrophic damage. Allies throughout the Indo-Pacific region would question whether American security guarantees have any meaning if Washington will not act when North Korea crosses explicitly stated red lines. This could drive South Korea and Japan to pursue independent nuclear weapons programs, collapsing the nuclear non-proliferation regime throughout Asia. China might conclude that American resolve has weakened sufficiently to permit more aggressive action regarding Taiwan. The credibility costs of inaction could exceed the military risks of action. 5 distinct scenarios encompass the range of possible outcomes over the next 14 days, each with dramatically different implications for regional security and American global standing. Scenario 1, immediate preemptive strikes. In this scenario, President Biden orders comprehensive air and missile strikes against the deployed tactical nuclear systems, their support infrastructure, and North Korean command and control facilities. The operation would involve cruise missiles launched from submarines and surface vessels, stealth bomber strikes against hardened targets, and cyber operations to disrupt North Korean military networks. The objective would be destroying the deployed systems before they can be used while degrading Pyongyang's ability to coordinate retaliation. However, this scenario requires accepting that some North Korean artillery and missiles will successfully strike South Korean and American targets, producing casualties potentially numbering in thousands. Intelligence analysts assess this scenario as moderately likely because it addresses the immediate threat while demonstrating American willingness to use force, but it involves accepting costs that peacetime democracies normally consider unacceptable unless facing truly existential threats. Scenario 2, coercive diplomacy with military buildup. This scenario involves the United States dramatically increasing military presence in the region while delivering ultimatum demanding immediate withdrawal of the deployed systems within 72 hours. Additional carrier strike groups would deploy, bomber aircraft would forward position to regional bases, and ground forces would conduct highly visible readiness exercises. The diplomatic message would be that withdrawal prevents military action, while failure to withdraw triggers the strikes described in Scenario 1. This approach attempts to achieve the strategic objective without firing shots, but it depends on Kim Jong-un concluding that American threats are credible and that withdrawal is preferable to conflict. Given North Korea's historical pattern of responding to pressure with escalation rather than capitulation, intelligence analysts rate this scenario as least likely to succeed, though it represents the option with lowest immediate costs if it does work. Scenario 3: Acceptance and Deterrence Adjustment. In this scenario, the United States concludes that the deployed systems, while unwelcome, do not fundamentally alter the strategic balance because American nuclear deterrent remains credible regardless of warning time reduction from 15 minutes to 90 seconds. Washington would condemn the deployment, impose additional sanctions, enhance missile defense systems, and increase military presence as demonstration of resolve, but would not launch military strikes. The calculation would be that accepting this deployment while strengthening deterrence avoids the catastrophic casualties that military conflict would produce. This scenario preserves peace at the cost of accepting North Korean fait accompli and potentially encouraging further provocations. Defense analysts consider this scenario moderately likely because it avoids worst-case outcomes while allowing Washington to claim it has strengthened defensive posture. Scenario 4: Chinese brokered de-escalation. This scenario depends on Beijing exercising decisive pressure on Pyongyang to withdraw the deployed systems in exchange for American concessions such as reduced military exercises, sanctions relief, or resumption of diplomatic dialogue. China would need to threaten North Korea with complete economic cutoff while simultaneously offering the United States framework for managed de-escalation that preserves American credibility. However, this scenario requires China prioritizing stability over its complex relationship with North Korea, and recent evidence suggests Beijing's influence over Pyongyang has diminished significantly. Intelligence analysts rate this scenario as possible but not probable given the deterioration in China-North Korea coordination evident in the crisis timeline. Scenario 5: Uncontrolled escalation to regional war. The nightmare scenario involves military action triggering escalation that neither side can control. American strikes destroy some but not all deployed systems. North Korea retaliates with artillery and missile attacks, producing mass casualties in Seoul. The United States responds with expanded strikes against broader target sets. North Korea launches additional missiles, potentially including strikes against Japan. Regional conflict expands to involve Chinese military intervention to prevent North Korean regime collapse, and the situation deteriorates into the first major power war since 1945, with nuclear weapons present on multiple sides. Intelligence analysts assess this scenario as low probability but catastrophic consequence, the outcome that all parties seek to avoid but that crisis dynamics could produce through miscalculation or uncontrolled escalation. Based on everything we have examined, the evidence patterns, the timeline progression, the military dispositions, and the political calculations, Scenario 3 represents the most probable outcome, with American acceptance of the deployment combined with defensive measures and diplomatic condemnation rather than military strikes. This assessment rests on several factors. First, the casualties that military action would produce exceed what American public opinion would support absent actual attack on United States territory or forces. Second, the risk of uncontrolled escalation creates uncertainty that rational decision makers would normally avoid unless facing truly existential threats. Third, the deployed systems, while concerning, do not fundamentally eliminate American deterrent capability, because nuclear retaliation remains assured regardless of whether North Korea achieves 90-second warning time. Fourth, the approaching presidential election creates political incentives to avoid military confrontation that could dominate campaign discourse and produce unpredictable electoral consequences. However, this most probable scenario carries the significant cost of demonstrating that American red lines can be crossed without consequence, potentially encouraging adversaries in other regions to test American resolve through their own provocations. The 30-day deadline that American officials privately communicated to Pyongyang through Chinese intermediaries expires on May 12, 2026, exactly 30 days from today. If North Korea has not withdrawn the deployed systems by that deadline, intelligence analysts project that American military action becomes significantly more likely because the passage of time without response would constitute complete abandonment of deterrent credibility. The Netflix documentary crew that has been following American military planning in the region reports that contingency preparations are intensifying daily, with strike packages being refined and target lists being updated continuously. Within 14 days, we will know whether this crisis produces the first military conflict between nuclear-armed adversaries since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, or whether it represents another chapter in the long history of Korean Peninsula brinkmanship that ultimately stops short of actual war. Type strike if you think President Biden should order immediate military action against the deployed systems. Type accept if you think the United States should condemn the deployment but avoid military conflict. Type China if you think Beijing should be pressured to force North Korean withdrawal. Your input helps us understand how the American public views this crisis and the engagement signals to the algorithm that this information matters. If you want to know what happens when the May 12 deadline expires, when American strike packages are finalized or diplomatic breakthrough emerges, when intelligence reveals Kim Jong-un's next move in this dangerous game of nuclear chess, you need to subscribe and hit that notification bell right now because this story is moving at extraordinary speed and the next development could occur at any moment. Because what we have covered tonight is the immediate tactical crisis on the Korean Peninsula. The deeper question, the question that extends beyond this specific deployment to the fundamental structure of global nuclear deterrence, is whether the world is entering a new era where nuclear-armed regional powers can successfully coerce their neighbors and defy great powers through weapons of mass destruction. And the evidence on that front suggests we are witnessing the collapse of the post-Cold War security order. I am George Will, and I will see you in the next investigation.